girls and boys for the purposes of rape, of sexual exploitation. There's a million new women and children in the industry every year. Unfathomable. And it stopped me truly in my tracks. And I turned to the side and I looked at the woman who had set up this table. Her name was Lisa Thompson from the Salvation Army. And I looked her in the eyes and I said, what do I do? And she slid a piece of paper across the table to me with a pen and said, well, you can put your name down on this mailing list. And at the time, and still looking back, if you think about the idea of putting your name on the mailing list, that's just about the smallest step you could possibly think of. And it's the exact type of thing people come up to me all the time and say, so what can I do besides, get more information? But it was exactly the most important step and could never have been overlooked. That was the step when I put my name down, gave her my email. I started to be exposed day after day after day to what was happening in our world and to stories of real people, real lives being ripped apart, and stories of rescue, stories of redemption, stories of healing. And it was utterly life-changing for me.
Wow, Bethany, they say, and you say, and IGM reports, that there are more slaves today than in the 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade combined.
Exactly.
Okay. What vacuum did that happen in? How is it possible that it has exploded to such a degree? Because you often hear that evil exists when there's a vacuum.
Right.
What happened and how did it happen?
Well, it's really primarily, when you talk to the experts in this field, it is a crime of economic opportunity.
Wow.
It is wholly driven by economics and by the fact that slave owners are not held accountable for owning human beings and exploiting them and using them. So when you can enter into a system that is deeply corrupt and functioning, even if it has good laws, a country with very good laws against slavery, but they're just ignoring those laws, if you can enter into that system and build relationships with law enforcement, with governments, with community leaders, with churches, if you can start to build a demand for law to actually be enforced, it starts to turn the tables of what slave owners believe they can get away with and what is worthwhile to them. So if it starts to become a high consequence to sell children, they see their colleagues getting put in jail, they see significant sentences handed down, they turn away. There's a major deterrent factor that comes from actually holding people accountable for their crimes.
I remember a story, an IGM story, and correct me if I've got this wrong, but of a man, I believe he was from Russia, but I can't remember exactly, but he was bragging about it, went back to his country to get some more funding. But in that meantime, IJM had come in and had really established a relationship with the law enforcement officials to the degree that they started to really believe that not only was this completely unjust, but it was also destabilizing to their culture to embrace such a crime. So they started to subscribe to the idea justice actually stabilizes our culture. Well, in the meantime, the man comes back, he's at a bar, and he's bragging, I'm opening a boy brothel and a girl brothel, will be open for business in X amount of days or weeks, and his bragging got him put in jail. And to me, that's, have you ever thought of how many children, boys, girls, men and women who've been saved from ever being traumatized because of your efforts around the world?
Right. Oh my goodness. I mean, my colleagues that I've been working with over the last 12 years or so, they are absolute heroes to me. Those who live in these countries all over the developing world and serve on the front lines. And then the leaders who are rising up within these nations, especially, there are leaders who are paving the way with the governments in their own country. And they came from slavery themselves. There's this man named Raja who was bonded into slavery, forced with his family, unable to get out for years. And he himself now leads work against slavery with the IJM in South Asia. And it's just stunning to see what happens with steps of courage forward. And it's always the hand of God at work. So we could sit back and try to think of all of our own good ideas for how to go about this big, massive problem. But when we lean into the Holy Spirit and trust that God is the one who loves justice even more than we do, that justice actually originates in God's heart with his character. He is the one who blazes the path forward and just shows us what steps to take one after another. And it'll look different for every single one of us. There's people out on the front lines. There's people here in Minneapolis, where I live, who are leading the way with trafficking in our own city and fighting it. And there's people who will lead in many different capacities that don't look like interacting directly with law enforcement or with victims who have been rescued, but who are teaching about it and who are spreading awareness and financially supporting it. There are artists who are depicting trafficking through painting and through photography and through music and song, and all of it needs to come together. Every single one of us needs to join together. There's no one in this who's the hero. Jesus is the hero. He's the one leading the way for us.
Remember, our mutual friend Sarah Groves said that, her justice journey is going to look different than mine and yours. She said, I'm just following the breadcrumbs that the Lord puts before me.
Yes.
And then I just see what the next thing it is that I'm supposed to do. I think that's what keeps us from getting overwhelmed, wouldn't you say? Is because he gives you grace for the moment, but he does ask you to step out and then take the next step.
Right. I think it's like so many other parts of life when we start to compare ourselves to others and we think that what they're doing is what we should be doing, or what they're doing is more interesting or more rewarding than what we get to do. That's where we get into a spiral and we get really off track from actually being able to see what it is that God is putting in front of us to do and what that breadcrumb is right in front of our face that we can pick up. And it's a day by day in community with people that you know and love, that you can share about the passions that God is putting on your heart, the concerns that you have for the world, and pray and work together to think through, okay, what's the next step? What's the next step?
We just got about 3 minutes before we go to our bottom of the hour break. But Bethany, I want to have you, this part of the conversation might be difficult, but talk about what we're dealing with here. I know the landscape domestically has changed significantly, just even in the last 5-7 years for trafficking in the U.S. But talk about who's most vulnerable, what's really going on internationally speaking, and then if we have to carry what's going on in the U.S. to the other side, let's do that. But start internationally. Who's most vulnerable, and what are we dealing with here?
It's absolutely the very poorest of the poor who are the most vulnerable. And slavery and trafficking, they come through violence and lies. So there's always the use of force and the use of lies to coerce people into these situations where they're being exploited. It looks like families who think that they're sending their child off to another city to make a good wage, a living wage that they can send back to their family. And it turns out that the person that they're sending them with, often a trusted family friend, is a trafficker and is a go-between with other traffickers. And that child gets handed off to one person who hands them off to another person, and money's exchanging hands all along the way. And the family has no idea where that child has gone, and the child has no way to get back. But the trafficker knows everything about where that child has come. So the child's locked in the brothel. And if they refuse to do what they're being asked to do, if they try to refuse customers who come in to rape them, the trafficker reminds them that they know where their family is. They know where they've come from. They can go back and harm the people that they love. And they beat them, they starve them, they drug them, they do whatever it takes to break them down, so that they just become that property that can be used and exploited over and over and over again.
Rape for profit multiple times a day. And to think about this quantifiably, millions upon millions of boys and girls, of women, are being held against their will, walking through this daily trauma. Got just about a minute here, but say a word about how you keep from getting overwhelmed by the gravity of this.
Oh, we can talk about this for the rest of the show. Absolutely. I started being completely overwhelmed and paralyzed when I first learned about this. And when I'd first get those emails into my inbox, I would sit in the computer lab at seminary and just hang my head in my hands and just think, how does anyone move forward at all, much less put this in front of their eyes every day? And I wrote that woman from the Salvation Army, and I asked her, and she wrote me back and reminded me. She said, this battle belongs to the Lord. This is a world that belongs to King Jesus. This is his world. And he's inviting us into this fight with him, but he's the one who's leading the way. It's on his shoulders. He's the one who carries the burden. And Jesus tells us that in the Gospels. He says, "Come to me. My yoke is easy. My burden is light. All you who are weary, come to me." He wants to strengthen us from the inside out every day. And that's never more true than when we face darkness and when we start to follow him into places that are just way over our head. We're there with him. We don't go on our own. He's with us before, behind, within, all around.
You know, maybe this is a ridiculous parallel, but, you know, if you decide to suddenly start working out and you go to the gym and you see a muscle head doing squats with a big, heavy amount of weight, and you're like, okay, this is what working out is, and you get yourself under that weight, you'll crush yourself. I think it's the same when you enter into the things that burden God's heart. If you're carrying too much, it will crush you. But there's a certain grace available, isn't there?
Absolutely.
For the stuff that he assigns to us. We're going to pause here. In fact, if you've got questions about the issue of justice, now's the time to call us, 877 Live 675. Man, that number has a good ring to it. 877-548-3675. I'm Susie Larson, sitting in for Chris Brooks today on Equipped. Bethany Huang of International Justice Mission is my guest. We're talking justice, God's heart for justice. More when we return.
Is this a busy time of the year for your company?